So today I'd like to talk about the movie Looper. It's one of my favorites, and I'm looking really forward to it. It was made in 2012. In terms of genre, Looper is many things. It's kind of a sci-fi movie, a romance, an action film. It's a thriller, and above all, it's pretty much boils down to a human drama. The film messes with genre a little bit. On the surface, it seems like a science fiction movie, especially with all of the time travel. But that more or less is just a superficial plot device that is used to, in my opinion, explore larger themes and questions. In my opinion, there isn't the metaphysical, conceptual stuff and the technical jargon that's needed to qualify fully as a sci-fi film. At several points in Looper, the characters reference not wanting to sit there and examine the mechanics of time travel, as it would fry their brains and they would be sitting there all day making diagrams with straws. And I think that was kind of a subtle and elegant way for Rian Johnson, the director, to avoid getting bogged down in all of these concepts of, how time travel actually gets done. It's more about the story and the characters. So this was Rian Johnson's third film. His first was Brick, which also starred Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Looper also stars Bruce Willis. So Brick was... Brick shared the noir influence that's present in both of these films. They're both kind of dark. Both movies have Joseph Gordon-Levitt doing a lot of voiceover narration, the way, a detective in one of those, dark 40s detective films guides you through figuring out the story. Their narration was very similar to that, and they're both somewhat dark. The movie Brick was a little bit more immature. It was set in high school, and it followed a, hard-boiled Joseph Gordon-Levitt detective who's investigating the death of his ex-girlfriend. But my judgment of that film being a little bit more mature may be skewed by the fact that it's actually set in high school. But regardless, Rian Johnson did a fantastic job in Looper. So kind of a brief rundown from the events and narration depicted in the film. We come to find that there's a subgroup of assassins in the future called loopers. These are called, this because there's a circle or loop created when the older version of themselves is eventually set back in time to be killed by their younger selves. So the beginning of this loop starts when they kill the older version of themselves that was zapped back to them. So this provides them with a golden payday of a lot of money that they can live on for the next 30 years, relaxing, enjoying their fortunes. After the 30 years eclipse, they're kidnapped, sent back in time, and then killed by their younger selves again. So the events that take place after the looper slays themselves are entirely based off of the inevitable beginning of the events, which is them killing their older selves after they're kidnapped. They are then sent back to the beginning of that series of events to allow them to play out in the first place, and it repeats, creating the loop. This presents an issue of the chicken or the egg and is fairly confusing to explain, but it's done very well in the film, and you understand exactly what's going on. There are a few questions that happens with this. Can time continue when these loops are created? Is time kind of stuck? How many versions of oneself are there, or is it just the same two versions used over and over? But other than those kind of technical questions, everything is explained very well. The plot construction is kind of confusing as there's time travel going on, so there's kind of three plots that happen. The first starts at the beginning of the film and ends 30 minutes into it. Then there's a brief 5 or 6 minute secondary plot, and then at 36 minutes, the third and final plot, which is, the most important, the other two just kind of explain things, plays out. So, there's some rising action at the beginning of the film. We learn who Joe, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, is. He's a looper. They explain all of that. The setting is 30 years into the future. It's kind of a dystopia. There's been an economic crash. There's drugs. You meet Joe's friends, the local mob called the Gap Men. You learn of a telekinetic ability called TK, which most people can only use to float quarters. You first learn what it means when a loop is closed. His friend Seth lets his older self run instead of killing him, and you see what happens there. And then the exact same thing happens to Joe, where his older version of himself, Bruce Willis, gets sent back to himself, and he doesn't kill him, and then you see the events of him kind of running around, trying to make things right for a couple minutes, and then during a chase scene, Joseph Gordon-Levitt falls backwards, down maybe 20 feet towards a car on the street, and it fades to black. So it pops up a couple different times, but this is, a fairly anticlimactic, style that's going on here, where we don't see what happens. But after that, 30 minutes, this kind of plot is over. It climaxes when he falls, and we don't see what happens. Then it kind of goes back maybe 10 minutes into the film, where Bruce Willis is being sent back in time again, but this time he's bound and his head is covered and you don't see who it is. So Joe kills him, then finds out who it was, but he gets his golden payday. He goes to China, he gets into drugs and crime, eventually meets a woman who makes him turn his life around. But then we see his 30 years has expired, he's getting kidnapped again, and his wife dies in that process. So once he sees his wife die, this makes him go crazy. He breaks free, kills the guys trying to kidnap him, and then he goes back in time voluntarily so that he can try to set things right. And that starts off plot one, when an untied Bruce Willis gets sent back in time and amazingly avoids being killed and escapes. So then our third plot kind of happens, again, where Bruce Willis gets away. It's similar to the end of plot one, but this time it's from Bruce Willis's old Joe perspective. We see Joe fall again. This time he just falls on the car, and old Joe picks him up and carries him away, and leaves him with a note saying, "Get out of town." But for the rest of this movie, moves on through plot three. There's this big plot to find the Rainmaker, who is responsible for ordering Bruce Willis to be sent back in time, to be killed. So Bruce Willis wants to kill him so that future himself can enjoy the rest of his life with his wife. You meet the young Rainmaker, who's a kid named Sid. You meet his mom named Sarah. Young Joe tries to prevent old Joe from killing Sid, and all these events happen. Then finally, it kind of climaxes when Joe ends up killing himself, which ends the loop. And there's a little bit of rising action, but that's more or less the end of the plot. So in terms of story arcs, since there are two kind of versions of Joe, who's the main character, there's kind of two simultaneous arcs going on at the same time. Both versions of Joe are kind of the main character, because both of them get the primary omniscient vantage point of things playing out through their first perspective, although most of it comes from young Joe. You also don't really know who to root for. The morality of old Joe is complex. He's a murderer, but he only kills bad guys. His motivation is love for his wife, which is respectable. Old Joe is also very wise and knocks some sense into young Joe in a scene where they meet and discuss and parlay at a diner. He's also a very conflicted man. At one point, he kills a kid who he thought would be the Rainmaker, but after he kills him, he finds out that it wasn't, because he doesn't disappear back to, his original time. So then he realizes what he did was in vain, and he just killed an innocent kid for nothing. The anguish and pain that he shows in his face and during this scene is very moving, and definitely shows how conflicted he is in doing these negative actions. But that scene is immediately followed by a flashback to old Joe remembering the first time he met his wife, which reminds us what he's doing all of this killing for. So it kind of justifies it, but he can't really be the hero as he's doing all these awful things. In the beginning of the movie, young Joe's motivation is his selfish desire to kind of be able to live out the rest of his life for himself. So it's kind of muddy here of like who's right, who's wrong. Old Joe living to save his wife is not as selfish, but ultimately it kind of gets boiled down where young Joe is the protagonist and old Joe is the primary antagonist. There are a lot of things old Joe represents, and he has changed radically in the film's timeline, but not necessarily during the course of the movie we see. So he's kind of static in that over the course of his life he's changed a lot, but what we get to know doesn't change at all. Young Joe is the one we see who goes through a dynamic change, which we see happen when he doesn't kill Sid after discovering he is in fact the Rainmaker. And more importantly, when he kills himself maybe 15 minutes later and towards the end of the film, so that he can end this loop that he's caught in where, well, I guess I'll get into that in a little bit in a moment, but, he leaves his save my life for me mentality. He finally sees the impact of his and his older self's actions. And then, if he allows his older self to shoot at Sid's mother, Sarah's going to step in the way. She's going to be shot. And then, Sid's going to disappear into the sugarcane right behind him. And he's going to grow up alone, which is very similar to the way Joe grew up. He talks about his mother leaving him when he was younger. So, he kind of sees how it happens, how he goes down the bad path like Joe did. And it's very important to highlight, this moment, because the director non-verbally makes it very clear that Joe sees himself in orphan Sid and can relate very much. So if he allows, Sid to disappear, he will eventually become the ruthless Rainmaker. After he's grown up, Sid will consolidate power, and he starts killing all the loopers because he doesn't want his mom to get killed. He wants to kind of set that right in time, so he orders all the loopers to be killed, so they're all getting kidnapped and sent back in time. And it's during this sequence that old Joe's wife is killed, which sparks old Joe coming back in time to kill Sarah, who is Sid's mother. So there's this, constant tit-for-tat cycle of what happens here. So young Joe finally sees this and says, and then I fixed it. So I decided to fix it after he sees what happens. And he makes the ultimate sacrifice by killing himself, which makes old Joe, Bruce Willis, disappear. He just kind of zaps off the screen. And, this effectively ends the loop and allows time to go on. And we see Sarah tuck Sid in at the end of the film. So we kind of assume he grows up with a mom, and he grows up to be a kind man, not committing any acts that start other loops of cyclical violence, although without time travel. But if somebody kills somebody's mom, that's gonna spark another evil person who's gonna grow up hard and kill somebody else's mom. People that grow up to be evil, they've been taught that from their life, from seeing that evil from others. So it's like the cycle of poverty and other things. It's kind of metaphorical for that. I think the director did a great job kind of bringing that social commentary in. So you see Sid, you see that this ends both the metaphorical and the actual cycle of the loop, and everything is kind of set right.